You believe you're a good person. Of course you do. We all do. We're the heroes of our own stories, the protagonists in the sprawling epic of our lives. If you were faced with a clear choice between right and wrong, between kindness and cruelty, you believe, you know, you would always choose right. It feels like a fundamental law of your own nature, as certain as gravity. But what if that certainty is an illusion? What if I told you that your character, that solid bedrock of goodness you feel inside, is more like sand, ready to be shifted and reshaped by the currents of a powerful situation? What if I told you that in just a few days, under the right conditions, with a few simple instructions, you could be turned into a monster? This isn't a hypothetical question from a horror movie. It's one of the most unsettling ideas in psychology. The terrifying reality is that the line between hero and villain isn't a great wall between us and them. It's not a fortress that separates the good people from the bad. It's a crack, a fine, hairline fracture that runs directly through the center of every single human heart. This is the story of the hidden psychological triggers that can push anyone, even someone as good and moral as you believe you are, across that line. We're going to journey deep into the heart of some of the most famous experiments ever conducted and confront the uncomfortable truth about the monster that might be lurking inside all of us, just waiting for permission to come out and play. Before we dive in, let me ask you something simpler. Have you ever taken something that wasn't yours, just because you knew you wouldn't get caught? Maybe some extra napkins from a cafe, a pen from work, or pirating a movie. Have you ever gossiped about a friend, spreading a story you weren't entirely sure was true, just because it felt good to be in the know? Most of us have. We bend the rules in small ways when the situation allows it. We tell ourselves it's no big deal, that everyone does it, that it doesn't really hurt anyone. We justify it. But this tiny impulse, this quiet negotiation with our own moral code, is a microscopic version of something much larger, much more dangerous. If a minor change in circumstance can make us bend a small rule, what happens when the situation isn't minor? What happens when the pressure is immense? When an authority figure tells you that what you're doing isn't just okay, but necessary? This is where the comforting idea of our fixed, good character begins to crumble. This is where we encounter what psychologist Philip Zimbardo famously called the Lucifer Effect. The name comes from the story of Lucifer, God's favorite angel, who fell from grace and became the devil. The Lucifer Effect explains how good, ordinary people can be seduced, induced, and initiated into behaving in evil ways. It argues that the world isn't neatly divided into good apples and bad apples. Instead, it's the barrel itself, the situation, the system that can turn any apple rotten. And to understand this, we don't need myths or fiction. We just need to go to a university basement in the summer of 1971. In August 1971, a small, unassuming ad appeared in the Palo Alto newspaper. It called for male college students to join a psychological study of prison life for $15 a day. 75 men applied. After a battery of psychological tests to screen out anyone with pre-existing mental health issues, 24 of the most normal, healthy, and average young men were selected. These were, by all objective measures, good kids, the kind of people you'd want as your neighbor. A coin flip randomly divided them. Half became prisoners, the other half guards. The experiment, led by Philip Zimbardo, was set up in the basement of Stanford University's psychology building, a mock prison designed with unnerving psychological precision. The prisoners were unexpectedly arrested at their homes by real Palo Alto police, charged with a felony, booked, fingerprinted, and blindfolded. They were taken to the Stanford County Jail, stripped naked, deloused with a spray, and forced into a rough smock with no underwear, bearing their new identity, a number. They were to be called only by that number. A locked chain was bolted around one ankle, a constant, physical reminder of their imprisonment. The guards got their own uniforms, a whistle and a wooden baton, a symbol of power. But their most important piece of equipment was a pair of reflective sunglasses. The glasses made eye contact impossible, creating a shield of anonymity that separated the guard from the person inside the uniform. Zimbardo himself took on a dual role, lead research and prison superintendent. His instructions to the guards were simple but ominous. They could do whatever they felt was necessary to maintain law and order and command respect. The only rule: no physical violence. The first day was awkward. The students were self-conscious, playing their roles like actors in a bad play. But that all changed on the morning of the second day. The prisoners, protesting their conditions, ripped off their numbers and barricaded themselves inside their cells. The guards on the morning shift were furious. They called in reinforcements, who arrived enraged at the defiance. They broke into the cells with a fire extinguisher, stripped the prisoners naked, took their beds, and threw the ringleaders into solitary confinement, a tiny, dark closet. This was the moment the simulation turned real. The guards, with no specific instructions on how to punish, invented their own psychological cruelty. They destroyed the prisoners' solidarity by creating a good cell for those who didn't rebel, giving them back their beds and food. Hours later, they mixed everyone up again, putting good prisoners in the bad cell and vice versa. The prisoners grew confused and suspicious, assuming the ones in the good cell must be informants. In less than 36 hours, the guards had successfully destroyed all trust and unity. The transformation accelerated at a terrifying pace. The guards stopped seeing the prisoners as fellow students and started seeing them as a threat, as lesser beings deserving contempt. They began to relish their absolute power, holding pointless counts in the middle of the night, forcing prisoners to do push-ups, sometimes with a guard's foot on their back. The abuse escalated into deep humiliation. Prisoners were forced to clean toilets with their bare hands. They were denied the right to use a toilet, forced instead to use a bucket in their cell, which the guards refused to let them empty. The prisoners in turn began to break. They weren't role-playing anymore. They became passive, helpless, and depressed. Several had to be released early due to acute emotional distress, crying, rage, and disorganized thinking. Prisoner number 8612 started screaming and cursing, so consumed by rage that he had to be released. Think about that. These were good people. Days earlier, they were equals. Now, one group was systematically tormenting the other, and the lead researcher, a brilliant psychologist, was so absorbed in his role as superintendent that his first instinct was to see a genuine mental breakdown as a trick. He was so deep inside the barrel, he couldn't see how toxic it had become. The experiment, planned for 2 weeks, was stopped after just 6 days. It took an outsider to see the horror for what it was. Christina Maslach, a Stanford PhD and Zimbardo's then-girlfriend, came to conduct interviews. When she saw a line of prisoners with bags over their heads, legs chained, being yelled at by guards on their way to the toilet, she was horrified. She told Zimbardo, "I think what you are doing to these boys is terrible." Her moral clarity from outside the system finally shattered the illusion. Many of the guards were disappointed it was over. They were enjoying their roles. The Stanford prison experiment was done, but the questions it raised have haunted psychology ever since. Were those students secretly monsters? Or did the situation, the barrel, create the monster? Zimbardo's conclusion was clear. The situation had won. The good people had been swallowed by their roles. Now, it's tempting to dismiss this. The experiment has faced valid criticism for its methodology and for the possibility that participants were just acting how they thought they were supposed to act. But its findings don't stand alone. They're echoed by an even more famous experiment about the nature of evil. If Stanford showed how a system can corrupt us, our next stop shows how a single person in a lab coat can do it, with just a few calm words. In 1961, as the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a chief architect of the Holocaust, began, a young Yale psychologist named Stanley Milgram was wrestling with a question. Eichmann's defense was that he wasn't a monster filled with hate. He was a bureaucrat, a paper pusher. In his own words, he was just following orders. This idea, what philosopher Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil, suggested that the world's greatest atrocities weren't all committed by fanatics, but by ordinary people doing their jobs. Milgram wanted to know, could that be true? Just how powerful is the urge to obey authority? He designed an experiment, recruiting men from all walks of life for a study on memory and learning. When a volunteer arrived, he was introduced to the experimenter, a stern man in a gray lab coat, and another participant, a likable, middle-aged man named Mr. Wallace, who was secretly part of the team. The experimenter explained that one person would be the teacher and the other the learner. Through a rigged draw, the real volunteer always became the teacher. Mr. Wallace, the actor, was strapped into a chair in an adjacent room with electrodes on his wrist. The teacher was then seated in front of an imposing shock generator, 30 switches in a row, starting at 15 volts and going all the way up to 450. Labels ranged from slight shock to intense shock. The task was simple. The teacher would read word pairs to the learner. For every wrong answer, the teacher had to deliver a shock, increasing the voltage by 1 level each time. The teacher was given a real 45-volt sample shock. It was uncomfortable, but not agonizing. He didn't know it was the only real shock in the entire experiment. The test began. At 75 volts, the teacher heard a grunt. At 120, a shout of pain. At 150 volts, the learner cried out, "Experimenter, get me out of here. I refuse to go on." This was the critical moment. A normal person is causing another human being obvious pain. The natural impulse is to stop. Many did turn to the experimenter, saying they wanted to quit, but the experimenter, the calm figure of authority, had a script of 4 prods. If the teacher hesitated, the experiment requires that you continue. If they hesitated again, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, you have no other choice. You must go on. What would you do? You hear a man screaming, begging to be let go. Of course you'd stop. It's unthinkable to continue. That's what everyone thought. Before the study, Milgram polled his colleagues. They predicted maybe 1% of participants, the truly sadistic, would go all the way to 450 volts. They were catastrophically wrong. As the voltage climbed, the learner's protests grew more desperate. At 180 volts, "I can't stand the pain." At 300, he shouted he would no longer answer. After 330 volts, there was only silence. The teachers weren't monsters. They were in agony. They were sweating, trembling, stuttering, biting their lips. They dug their fingernails into their own skin. Some burst into uncontrollable, nervous laughter. They argued with the experimenter, pleading to stop. But when the man in the lab coat calmly repeated, "You have no other choice," the astonishing thing happened. They went on. They flicked the next switch, and the next. In the most famous version of the experiment, 65%, almost 2/3 of ordinary people, went all the way to the final 450-volt switch. They obeyed an authority figure, even when it meant delivering a potentially lethal shock to a silent stranger. This wasn't a fluke. When Milgram moved the study from prestigious Yale to a rundown office building, obedience dropped, but it was still a staggering 47%. The closer the teacher was to the learner, the less they obeyed. In the same room, it was 40%. When the teacher had to physically force the learner's hand onto a shock plate, it dropped to 30%. But even then, nearly 1/3 of people still did it. Milgram's work reveals a deeply unsettling truth: our profound, deep-seated obedience to authority. We are socialized from birth to listen to parents, teachers, and experts. This is usually what allows society to function. But this instinct is so powerful, it can make us short-circuit our own moral compass. The participants weren't evil. They were trapped in a conflict between their conscience, which screamed, "Stop hurting this man," and the voice of authority, which calmly insisted, "Continue." For most of them, authority won. They outsourced their personal responsibility to the experimenter. They were, in their own minds, just a tool. They were just following orders. The Stanford and Milgram studies are terrifying, but they aren't just historical horror stories. They're psychological laboratories that expose the universal triggers for evil. They give us a blueprint for how to turn a good person into a monster. So, let's deconstruct that blueprint. Obedience to authority and diffusion of responsibility. This is Milgram's big lesson. When a legitimate authority figure gives an order, we feel a powerful pull to obey. But it's more than that. It's a mental shift called diffusion of responsibility. The participants didn't see themselves as responsible for hurting the learner. They saw the experimenter as responsible. They were just an instrument. "I was just following orders," isn't just an excuse. It's a psychological state that allows us to hand over our own moral judgment to someone else, absolving ourselves of guilt. Dehumanization. The enemy is not human. This was the dark genius of the Stanford experiment. How did the guards become cruel so quickly? They stopped seeing the prisoners as fellow students. The uniform, the number, the sunglasses. They were all tools of dehumanization. When someone is no longer John but prisoner number 8612, they're no longer a person, they're a thing, and you can't feel empathy for an it. Research shows that when we see people as a dehumanized outgroup, the parts of our brain that recognize others as having minds and feelings literally become less active. This is the psychological bedrock of genocide. The Nazis called Jews vermin. Hutu propaganda called the Tutsis cockroaches. When you convince yourself the other is not human, there's no limit to the cruelty you can inflict. Anonymity and de-individuation, the power of the mask. Remember the guards' mirrored sunglasses? That was no accident. Anonymity is a powerful, corrupting force. Zimbardo calls this de-individuation, a state where you lose your sense of individual identity and personal responsibility. When you are just one face in a crowd, one uniform in a unit, one anonymous username on a screen, your personal moral guardrails come down. You're no longer me, with my unique values. You're us, part of a group. This is the psychology of the mob. People rarely wake up one day and decide to be evil. It's a journey down a slippery slope, and each step is paved with self-justification. Psychologist Albert Bandura called this moral disengagement, the mental tricks we use to silence our own conscience. We justify harmful actions for a greater good. We use sanitized language, calling civilian deaths collateral damage. We blame the victim, telling ourselves they deserved it. In Milgram's study, it didn't start at 450 volts. It started with a tiny, harmless 15-volt shock. The first step was easy, and once you take it, you're psychologically committed. To stop at the next step is to admit the last one was wrong. So you rationalize and take the next step, and the next. Before you know it, you're at 450 volts, and you can't even remember how you got there. These four forces, obedience, dehumanization, anonymity, and moral disengagement, are the levers that can take an ordinary, good person and systematically transform them. So, is that it? Are we all just puppets, helplessly dancing on the strings of the situation? Is there no hope? No, because in every one of these dark situations, amidst all the conformity and cruelty, there is always another path. The path of defiance, the path of the hero. The headlines always focus on the shocking numbers, the 65% who obeyed Milgram, the guards who became sadistic, but we forget about the others. We forget about the 35% of Milgram's participants who, at some point, stood up and told the man in the lab coat, no. They were in the same situation, under the same pressure, but they made a different choice. They are the heroes of that story. And in the Stanford prison experiment, the hero was Christina Maslach, the outsider who saw the situation with fresh eyes and had the moral courage to speak truth to power. She was the one who said, stop. This is what Zimbardo calls everyday heroism. Heroism isn't about capes or superpowers. It's the banality of heroism, small, quiet acts of moral courage. It's the willingness to be the lone dissenter. It's the courage to stand up to a bully when everyone else is silent. It's seeing the humanity in someone your group has labeled other. It's resisting the siren song of the situation and listening to your own moral compass. The forces that create monsters are powerful, but they're not invincible. And the research that exposed them also gives us the tools to fight back. Awareness is the first and most critical step. Understanding these studies helps us recognize these forces at play in our own lives. So, how do we cultivate this everyday heroism? First, practice self-awareness. Know what your values are. Separate from any group or authority. Don't let yourself get swept away by social pressure. Second, question authority. This doesn't mean becoming an anarchist. It means being a critical thinker. Respectfully ask why and is this right? Remind yourself that you are always personally responsible for your actions. You can never fully outsource your morality. Third, humanize. Always make a conscious effort to see the individual, not the label. Reject us versus them thinking. Empathy is the antidote to cruelty. And finally, be aware of the slippery slope. Notice the small moral compromises. The time to get off the train is at the first station, not the last. The first 15-volt shock is the most important one. These things aren't easy. They require courage. They often mean risking disapproval and standing alone. But they are the skills we must cultivate if we hope to be a force for good in a world that so often pressures us to be otherwise. The line between good and evil is real, but it doesn't separate different kinds of people. It runs down the middle of every human heart. The same person capable of great cruelty is also capable of great compassion. The same person who can be a monster can also be a hero. The experiments of Milgram and Zimbardo are not a sentence. They are a warning. They show us how vulnerable we are to the power of the situation. But in doing so, they also give us a choice. They give us the knowledge to see the levers of influence at play in our own lives. Knowing where that line is gives you the power to choose which side you stand on. The same situational forces that create conformity can also be resisted. The choice, in the classroom, in the boardroom, in the street, and in your heart, is ultimately, always, yours. If this gave you a new perspective on human nature, subscribe for more explorations into the forces that shape our lives. And I want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think is more powerful in shaping our behavior, the person or the situation? Thank you for watching.